Good day, everyone. My name is Matt Transhin. I serve as the president of March for Science. I am joined again by my friend, colleague, and partner, Hita Lakhani, Global South Focal Point for Youngo. Hita, how are you?
Doing great, Matt. Thank you so much for having us here today.
Of course, of course. Good to be with you, my friend.
So today we have a very special guest with us today, Vladislav Kaim from Moldova. Vlad, again, is a good friend of mine. I've known him since 2019 when we met in Abu Dhabi for the first time. Um, Vlad is a master's student completing his master's in economics, and he's also part of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group. Vlad and I go back to a group that we called ourselves the Super 30, the 30 of us who were part of the Abu Dhabi Climate Summit. So, Vlad, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and we look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Likewise. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, Vlad, Youth Advisory Group, can you talk about the impetus for its creation and what that experience has been for you?
I think that the impetus for its creation, from my point of view, because I can speak here only from my perspective, as I do not know the exact tracing of this idea, comes from this realization that youth that has grown ever so more active in climate action has demonstrated its potential not only in the streets or in community organizing, but also in those bigger venues where it's usually pretty hard to see the results of your work in real time, but at the same time, those are the venues that are so critical to the success of multilateral international climate efforts that you simply cannot ignore them. And there's where I think it was an initial trial run with the youth advisory group that was helping organize the Youth Climate Summit in 2019. And I guess that experience was considered a success that allowed later to plunge into that format of the youth advisory group by the UN Secretary General. In terms of how I guess the second part, if I remember well, was about how I perceive the work I'm currently doing. Well, it's a big responsibility, first and foremost, because having 7 people that are kind of implicitly expected to be representing of the whole youth, out there, even though that's not like formally that is not true, but that's sort of the expectation that you have. And at the same time, combining it with the ability to produce advice and suggestions that would fall in Secretary General's ear, and B, which he can relay somewhere further according to his needs, according to his climate strategy, and so on. It's a very careful act. It's a very careful balancing act, which requires a lot of creativity and a lot of necessity, not just this standard, they say thinking out of the box, but thinking about finding new corners within the box, because within this diplomatic circuit, sometimes you may find out that the box has more layers than you initially think.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, looking at the 7 of you, you're all extremely complementary. I mean, obviously, each of you are picked from a different region of the world to really have that global representation. But you also have, very distinct backgrounds that represent pieces of this puzzle that really make up solutions for climate action. You yourself are an economist. And in reading the report that the Youth Advisory Group issued at the end of last year, there's a focus on green jobs. I imagine you had probably something to do with that. Can you talk about what was laid out in the report and really what that call to action and recommendation?
Got it. So as far as the report goes and its content that is related to green jobs, first of all, it starts with taking stock of what is happening at the confluence of climate change trends and economic trends and labor market trends throughout 2020. What we see is the confluence of 3 trends. First one is that now that we have seen what a pandemic caused by a zoonotic disease aka disease caused by encroaching, people encroaching on nature and climate can actually cause. Secondly, its impact on the overall economic situation and the job market, and that it has especially hard hit the young people. Not only in terms of dislocation from the job market that has already happened throughout 2020, but which will cause many ripple effects throughout this decade. And finally, already registered desire way before the pandemic of a generational shift towards a strong affirmation of desire for having a work job with purpose. And the climate action is featuring very highly among those purposes that the youth usually espouse. And in terms of prescriptive part, in terms of recommendations, we have strongly urged the governments, both national and subnational, in their stimulus packages to place their bets correctly, and that would mean investing precisely in green jobs, because first of all, targeted committed investments into repurposing current hard-to-abate sectors and helping create new green sectors in economy, both in industry but also in services, helps significantly to enlarge in general the pool of jobs that we have right now compared to what we have right now. B, if coupled with investments in right skills and educational reforms, it helps to make sure that those prospective jobs are not just numbers, but actually are those jobs that can be filled by people who are actually prepared for those jobs, who are actually competent to do them. And C, it allows not just to create jobs per se, but it also allows to create new revenue streams for national budgets, which means that those investments will pay off relatively fast. And the multiplier from those investments will be amazing, because it will allow for both increased productivity and increased life satisfaction for the youth who feel that they are both contributing to solving the climate crisis and are able to earn a good dime. And that also has pretty significant implications down the line, because bigger revenues means that there is actually more opportunities to funnel further funds into the sectors and industries that we consider crucial for climate action, and at the same time lose less as nations on factors that distract us from our success. Like, for example, when people will have to skip more work to healthcare reasons, or when the destruction of natural capital accelerated by a business as usual model will affect the assets that we have in our economy. And mapping those issues, critical points, together with certain prescriptions that can be at the same time general inserts of like how you can apply them regardless of what level of income you are, but at the same time being specific enough to say what pain points you should attack first. That was the purpose of the green jobs part of our report.
Very cool.
Yeah, I actually want to go back a little bit, Vlad. We've all been talking about green jobs. It's now a term that is being used quite often than even what it was used, say, last year. The COP26, UNFCCC COP26 is talking a little bit about green jobs. The ILO is talking about climate action and jobs. But from a layman's point of view, what exactly would a green job mean? How would you explain it to someone who's not within the climate space?
So what people who are not following the climate agenda very closely need to know about the definition of green jobs. First of all, it does not exist, internationally agreed. So I can only vouch here for myself and for the vision of what a green job is that I personally hold. I hold it in a broader sense than it's usually sort of shared in the community. To me, a green job is a job that is particularly focused on tasks that are helping within the industry, within the enterprise, to either directly green the production processes, or it has a support function to green other processes down the line. So to exemplify what I mean, greening directly a production process, it's people who are involved in green energy sector, for example, or with the automotive sector producing electric cars. But then a lot of focus and conversations focused on those jobs, particularly now, for example, in the high-level dialogue on energy. happening within the UN confines. But I argue that we also need to take into account the indirect green jobs. Those being, for example, if you're working in a bank and you are helping let's take an investment bank or something like that, that helps a company that is, for example, in clean tech, either underwrite the issuance of their first bonds, like green bonds, like obligations that are linked to their environmental performance, or issue their shares for the first time, do an IPO. You are also doing a green job because you are helping to attract funds to a company that is accomplishing within their industry important climate goals. It could be also mostly likely a company that is committed itself to net zero. So the spectrum of what can be considered a green job in terms of like, if you name the jobs, it's quite wide. It can be from person that is installing solar panels to the person that's working in a bank doing underwriting of certain bonds or doing IPO. The key point is that you contribute to an activity in the real sector of the economy, in industry or in services adjacent to the industry. You're contributing to reducing the carbon footprint of said enterprise and said industry.
So, Vlad, it's, when we talk about the state of the climate crisis, it's really easy to get pessimistic. Most countries' existing climate goals, their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are woefully inadequate. Most countries are not on track to hitting those woefully inadequate goals. But there is some hope for optimism when looking at the changing landscape of the marketplace when it comes to renewable energy and battery storage. Can you talk about the importance of where the market is headed and how much has changed even since the Paris Agreement from 5 years ago? And does that give you hope about humanity's ability to make this transition, elevate its climate goals, and actually achieve them?
So first of all, I think we should not fall into this ecological fallacy of government versus market when it comes to the success of green energy, because a lot of the market success of green energy owes to sustained, committed investments by the governments in the very early stages of development in the green energy. And that lesson actually should be applicable to many other developments in innovation and technology that we still need to do in order to be better in our climate action. Is that these market successes, they don't come out from nowhere. They require significant, stable, committed buy-in from the governments that need to learn to be venture capitalists of first resort in order to find climate action actually in a way that will put innovation, science, and technology at the forefront of it. Because the key to bringing those technologies in renewable energy was to provide a bridging period where what is known as valley of the death for adopting technologies, that's the period where it's already rolled out, but it's still commercially unviable because it's not on scale. So no actually private venture capitalists, for example, would take on developing. So managing that valley of the death period, providing the guidelines in terms of basic scientific technological priorities, and behaving, as I said, like venture capitalists of first resort is the task that governments should already be doing. They already should be focused on shaping the markets, because the reason why the markets in green energy, for example, are so well developed is because they were shaped correctly to begin with. Even though it has not been, of course, without bumps on the road. Like, for example, in the US, I know that the basket case of what your right-wing commentators were calling the misappropriation of government funds and so on has been the very famous case of the Solyndra in 2011, when the company went bust after it got $450 million of public money. But at the same time, they seem to forget that at the same time, there were money invested in Tesla at the same time. And look how it paid off. Look where Tesla is now. There's another thing that the contract there in terms of getting a return on investment was made in a way that actually the US government wasn't quite able to get a return on their investment. But anyway, it shows that, first of all, of course, it has risks. So you cannot always be right. But if you place the bet strategically and keep the focus right, the other markets that are needed to be shaped in clean technology and innovation will actually be shaped correctly. And in that particular case, I'm an optimist, but I keep being cautious in terms of how much time it will actually require from the standpoint of the political will. Because the political cycles and innovation cycles, they are badly out of sync.
You mentioned the Obama administration from a decade ago. Which governments today do you feel like are good examples of following through on that critical need as you've laid out?
Well, for starters, I don't want to single out everyone so they would not relax. And secondly, I think even the most progressive ones have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
But of course, it's commendable. It's commendable to have European Union, Japan, China already committed to net zero targets, and to have, for example, Canada adopting a pretty high federal price on carbon. But at the same time, we need to battle this emerging trend of announcing net zero commitments that sound nicely in the long term, but at the same time don't offer a really credible path. And that's where everyone, and I mean everyone, has a lot of work to do.
I'm curious, Vlad, when we talk about net zero, that there's a focus on climate mitigation. And oftentimes when we talk about the climate crisis and climate action, there is really almost a singular focus on climate mitigation, and climate adaptation seems to not get nearly as much play. It looks very much like the world is headed towards a 1.5 degree world, if not a 2 degrees world. From an economist standpoint, what are your thoughts about ways in which we can achieve climate adaptation goals in a scalable way?
So in terms of climate adaptation, I think the concept of natural capital, first of all, will help us a lot. When we talk about natural capital, we mean first and foremost that our ecosystems, the way they are directly responsible for enabling certain activities, both social, economic, and daily, that we are able to perform. And they bring an immense value just by being out there. And the way that they are impacted right now, unfortunately, may not be reversed in many cases. But at the same time, what can be done is to make sure that the communities who populate those ecosystems, they understand the value that it brings to their lives, and that the governments, most importantly, understand that, because communities actually mostly understand that, particularly so when we talk about indigenous communities, for example. But the governments, they are driven by this very purist, accountant-like logic of cost-benefit calculus that really does not take into account the value that nature brings to the lives of those communities. And so if we adopt this type of analysis, if governments adopt this type of analysis, we as society learn to learn to value not just what we see, but also to value, how should I put it, what will happen if we are unable to see or use that natural capital is extremely important, so that the right decisions for financing, for development in adaptation would be taken. For that, we need a much more democratic landscape in how we govern adaptation, how we govern development, compared to these top-down messianic approaches coming from the Western countries and donors that we have seen, to an approach in which it doesn't matter how many bucks you bring to the table in terms of what voice you will have over the project. Of course, as a donor, you have all the rights for the oversight. But if you're actually interested in the success, you will be interested in driving adaptation efforts together with the communities affected as co-equals.
Absolutely. And from there, talking about adaptation, we do need to move towards a world which go beyond 2 degrees, and we do need to ensure that global temperature rise does not go beyond 1.5 degrees, because it is a matter of survival for quite a few people. Why do you think it is important for the IPCC 1.5 degrees report to be formally welcomed at COP26?
Because when the IPCC report finally gets its get out of jail card, it will create an avalanche of acceptance that simply will not be able to be ignored. To bring an example of why would that be important, we all know the issue with the reports written by International Energy Agency and the reticence that is there in terms of incorporating a fully fledged, fully developed 1.5 degrees scenario that will at the same time also be the forefront of their analysis. That still has not happened. And that has huge implications down the line for the governments who are actually relying on the IEA projections in their frameworks for mitigation, for adaptation, for energy policy, for many other policies. Because they look at what they read, then they go to their constituencies, to the parliaments, and say like, "Hey, here are the experts, who said this and this and this." But what they don't know, like what those constituencies don't know, is that those same governments are kind of in a no pressure way telling like what you can write and what you cannot write. And that's why, for example, we see this pressure on the IPCC from certain governments that under the veil of the fact that you should remain descriptive and not prescriptive, are keeping this IPCC report kind of apart from not just the public eye, because that's impossible to do, but from the center, from becoming a centerpiece of climate scenario planning. And that's why I say that once it is adopted, first of all, other agencies and important players in the multilateral sphere, they will have no other choice than to follow it eventually. And most importantly, then there will be no other choice but to expand what we consider science in those reports, because then inevitably there will come other trade-offs to consider economically and socially, and it will be simply impossible to do this without economists, sociologists, anthropologists, and other specialists. And then from there, when we answer to the question of what is happening holistically, inevitably there will be a pressure to also put out there the question of what needs to be done. And while I agree that the IPCC report, as far as the policies recommendations potentially would go, should not be like a Bible, at the same time, it should have more teeth to it. And I think that, unfortunately, maybe not in a few years from now, but in 5 years from now, I'm sure that this will be exactly its function, and it will be a real North Star for any other reports and policies that are put out there.
Well, Vlad, thank you so much for joining us, my friend. On behalf of March for Science and Young-Go, we've really appreciated you making time and joining us. And let's get that avalanche started. Let's put pressure on governments to step up and recognize the climate crisis for what it is as we head into COP26 and beyond. So thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you so much.